trying to figure out what's wrong with this section right here. That like it's empty. So I don't spit that way. So it's good to be back. We had an awesome trip. I wish I had time to share a little bit about it, but I really want to get into this series of Foreshadows. I do want to let you know before I jump into this that if you look back in the back corner, there's a sign that says prayer. So from this point on, our prayer team will be available to pray with you in between first and second service and in between third and fourth. So if you're coming to the second service, you need to come a little early or you need to come back in the evening. But anytime you need prayer, just go back there and they would love to pray with you. So should we jump into this Foreshadows series? Anybody for that? Okay, so I got to tell you a story. On a night way back in 2004, I woke up around 1 o'clock in the morning, and I couldn't go back to sleep. And it didn't feel like it was kind of an insomnia thing. It felt more like God had something to say to me. So I got up, and I went downstairs, and I began to pray. And within seconds, I began to hear really clearly the word foreshadows clinging around in my head. Or clanging around. And so I opened my Bible and I started looking up that word, and I ended up studying and hearing from God for about 4 hours that night. Never went back to sleep, never felt tired the next day. And this same scenario went on for the next 4 nights. And by the end of those 4 days, God had downloaded most of the content of what you're going to hear in this 10-week series. And so I want you to know that, at least from my perspective, this is no ordinary series, and I take no credit for its content. And Foreshadows is what I think an amazing preview of what God was going to do throughout history. Let me tell you what it is. Foreshadows unveils the mystery of God's plan to build an eternal family. And he does this by focusing on the stars of his story, not the stars in the sky, but the main people in the story, which are the Jewish people. And I pray that this series will revolutionize how you read your Bible, how you live out your faith from this point on. One of the greatest trilogies of all times, I hope you've all seen it, is Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. Everybody has seen that, I'm sure. It's based on the epic story by J.R.R. Tolkien. And these 3 films, The Fellowship of the Rings, The Two Towers, and The Return of the King, tell the story of a heavy-laden hobbit with a very un-hobbit-like quest who's joined by all sorts of strange creatures as well as common man. And the story is full of adventure and romance and evil and good. And movie trilogies like Jackson's are meant to be absorbed in its entirety and in chronological order. And so if you only watch the first episode of like The Fellowship of the Rings, the story will have no resolution. On the other hand, if you only watch the final episode, The Return of the King, the story has no context. And Peter Jackson would shudder at the thought of someone not experiencing the fullness of the world that Tolkien created by not engaging in all 3 films. Well, I don't know if you're aware of it or not, the Bible is also a trilogy that's meant to be absorbed in its full entirety and in chronological order. And like all the great stories, God has written one beautiful, seamless love story that is full of romance and full of adventure, mysterious twists and turns, and nail-biting suspense, which all build up to this powerful climax when the hero of the story carries out a very bold and daring mission to rescue his lover who's been taken captive by the evil villain. And so it appears often in God's story that the hero is losing, but in the end, his plan succeeds. And after the evil villain is finally defeated, the lovers are reunited in our favorite and final triumphant, heartwarming scene where the lovers ride off into the sunset to live happily ever after. Sounds like a great medieval legend, doesn't it? And yet, this is no make-believe story. This is the real deal. And the God of the Bible wrote this story, the greatest love story ever told. In fact, since all humans are made in the image and likeness of God, all the other stories that have ever been imagined or conceived are merely smaller versions of this big story that God wrote. God's story is embedded in our DNA, whether we believe in God or we don't believe in God. And his story, as the song goes, is his tale as old as time. And it's meant to be absorbed from beginning to end. Listen to this. Isaiah chapter 46, verse 9 through 11 says it this way. Remember the former things, those of long ago. I am God and there is no other. I am God and there's none like me. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. And I say my purposes will stand and I will do all that I please. From the east I summon a bird of prey. From far off land a man to fulfill my purpose. What I have said, that I will bring about. What I have planned, that I will do. And notice how this passage clearly tells us that God's story will unfold page by page exactly the way he wrote it, and nothing can stop it. Foreshadows will demonstrate how this amazing story fits together into one perfect and seamless account that unfolds in a thrilling trilogy in 3 very dramatic episodes. I don't know, have you ever been to a movie that is shown in 3D? Anybody done that, where you have to wear special glasses? Well, God's story needs special glasses too, in order to see the story properly. Those who only read the story of the first episode wearing these glasses, can you see those? Are unable to understand and embrace the hopeful messianic future that unfolds during the second episode of God's story and is completed during the third episode. And so they have no resolution, and it's easy to get stuck in the story, okay? On the other hand, those who only read the second episode of God's story wearing these glasses don't fully understand how the first episode impacts the second episode. And so they have no context, and it's easy to get way off track in the story. And so in order to understand God's story, let's see if I have the right glasses here. All right. You need to wear these special glasses. And these glasses allow us to connect the dots between all the episodes. And so when you wear these special glasses, you not only begin to see God's story in brilliant, three-dimensional awe and wonder, you also know where you're at in the story and what you're supposed to do, how your story intersects into the big story. And so as we embark together on this incredible journey called Foreshadows, you're going to need a Bible that contains the whole story, not just episode 1 and not just episode 2, but the entire story, the whole story. So if you don't have one, our ushers would be glad to give you a Bible free. They're always free. Anytime you need a Bible, just go back into the corner there and they'd be glad to give you one. Okay, so a preview of God's trilogy actually begins in eternity past, and it ends in eternity future. God is eternal. In other words, he's got no beginning, and he's got no end. God has always existed, and he'll always exist. And God's story is filled with this teaching about his eternal existence. For instance, from the first episode of God's story, from the Hebrew Bible, we get God's most sacred and unpronounceable name, spelled with the 4 Hebrew letters, Yud, He, Vav, He. And this word is really a contraction of the verb to be, or to exist. Yud, He, Vav, He actually contains past, present, and future language features. And so in this one mysterious word, God describes himself as the God who was and is and who will be. That's what that word really tells us. God said through the prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 44:6, that I am the first and I'm the last, and apart from me there's no other God. And then from the second episode, from the New Testament, from the book of Revelation, chapter 22, verse 13, Jesus says, I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. And what these verses are all saying is that no one created God. Now that makes a short circuit because we say he's always existed, but how can something exist if it's not created? Well, don't go there because you'll just have smoke coming out of your ears. God existed before time began, and God will exist after time ends. God lives outside of time. He's eternally existent. You and I, we're stuck in time. We can't run away from the clock. It's always ticking, and we're just stuck here, at least for now. So let's take a closer look at this eternal God by looking at Genesis. The first verse in Genesis chapter 1 starts out in Hebrew. It says, Bereshit bara Elohim. Those are the words that say, in the beginning, God created. Here we see that before anything materially existed in the universe, just before some major historical event called the beginning, God already existed in eternity past. And so at some point, before this historical event called the beginning, God decides to create something outside of eternity, and consequently history and time begins. Think of Genesis 1:1 as God pressing the play button on history, marking the beginning of this whole story, the story that God wrote. And thus, episode 1 is launched with rave reviews by the critics, right? Stunning, inspiring, a brilliant tale of love, says Rotten Tomatoes. Mysterious awe and wonder with plenty of twists and turns, says Roger Ebert. The Bible also tells us in many places that history and time as we know it today not only has a beginning, but eventually has an ending. Or maybe a better way to say this is that our now flawed history will eventually arrive at a new beginning with a flawless future. Much the same way all the great stories eventually arrive at their ending, when we are left to imagine that when we see the words "the end" scrolling across the screen, it's really just the beginning of a great new future. Isn't that what we think? We see this story that things started off good, then all of a sudden the dark music started playing and the evil villain shows up. The hero comes and saves the day. They ride off into the sunset. The end. Is it the end? No, we imagine that they have a great new future in front of them. The prophet Isaiah speaks about this new beginning in Isaiah 65:17. He says, "See, I will create a new heaven and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind." And then he goes on to describe this world that's free of conflict and pain and suffering. Revelation 21:1 has Isaiah 65:7 in view when it says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away." And of course, it also goes on to describe the same kind of nirvana-like peaceful world where there's no pain or suffering, no sorrow, not even death. And so in the beginning, the first beginning that is, God creates the universe in which we all live now. And time and history begin to click off like the counter of a video player. And it's still clicking off. He starts by creating the heavens. He moves to creating the earth, and ultimately to creating everything that lives on the earth. The Hebrew word for God in this passage is the word Elohim, which is the plural form for the word God. Eloah is the singular form of the word God. And it's used 70 times in the Hebrew Bible, and it's almost always used as a reference to the God of Israel. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, why would God choose to introduce himself for the very first time in the plural rather than the singular? That would be like me introducing myself as, "Hi, I'm Jeans." It's grammatically incorrect, right? And we might just dismiss this as this plural introduction as kind of stylist Hebraic prose, which some people do, if we didn't get to verse 26 to discover another plural oddity. When we fast forward to Genesis 1:26, it says, "Then God, Elohim, plural, said, 'Let us make man in our own image.'" You catch that? Let us make man in our own image. Who exactly is God having a conversation with here that would somehow be on an equal creative level with him? Especially when God declares over and over again in the Bible that he alone is God and that there's no one else like him. Now listen, I'm Jewish, and we Jews believe that there's only one God. There's only one God, which, by the way, you should believe the same thing. And the reason we believe that there's only one God is because our Hebrew Bible, the first episode of God's story, tells us over and over again that there's only one God. In every synagogue service, every week, we recite what we call the Shema Israel from Deuteronomy 6:4. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. So make no mistake about it, there's only one God. And the moment your theology says there's more than one God, you know you have gotten off track. And some people have, because they don't have the context. However, we have to ask ourselves the question, if there's only one God, then why would God ever use a plural noun to describe himself, and especially the very first time he introduces himself to the world? And then why would he say just a few verses later, let us make man in our own image later on? The answer to that question requires special glasses in order to do that. So the first episode of God's trilogy, you remember the story, begins in a very serene garden. God creates Adam and Eve, places them in this garden. It's a great place where both the man and the woman are intimately connected to their God and to each other. But a short time later, Adam and Eve are deceived by the evil villain. The dark music comes on, right? The evil villain shows up, who is Satan. They sin, causing themselves to be separated from God and from each other, and both are expelled from the security and the comfort of this perfect paradise. It's a pivotal point in the story. Things really begin to heat up from there, because the rest of the story will unfold a daring rescue plan by God to bring all of mankind back into an intimate relationship, not only with him, but with each other. And this rescue plan involves a superhero the Hebrew Bible calls the Hamoshiach, the Messiah, the Savior, who will save the day and make everything right in the world once again. And the Bible talks about this superhero all over the first episode of his story. Here's just one of those passages from the prophet Micah in chapter 5, verse 2. And he says this, "But you, Bethlehem, Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times." Now, what's interesting to note about this particular hopeful messianic passage is that it speaks about a superhero whose origins are from old, a long time ago. And since Micah already lived several thousand years ago in a period of history that we would already consider to be ancient, just how old and how ancient is the superhero that Micah is describing? Well, just the fact that Micah tells us that this messianic superhero will have previously existed before he ever shows up to save the day should reach out and grab anyone's attention. Oh, wait, he existed before? But if we put on our special whole story glasses, we should see that what Micah is alluding to is that this superhero existed before the beginning of time. And if we look at John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, going into the second episode of the story, he says it this way. He says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And the Word was God." Who's the Word? Yeshua, right? Jesus is the Word. Jesus was with God in the beginning, it says. And through him, through who? Through Jesus, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. So it starts off the same way that Genesis 1:1 does, right? In the beginning. And the mention of the Word in this passage obviously refers to Jesus, who was not only there creating with God in the beginning, but is in fact God himself. And then verse 14, if you fast forward, it goes on to tell us that the Word, Jesus, became flesh and dwelled among us. So how can we put this all together? Well, from episode 1, if just to review, according to Genesis 1:1, God Elohim, plural, was in the beginning. He created in the beginning. According to Genesis 1:26, he's there co-creating with at least one other equal. Micah tells us that the superhero in this story will have eternal origins. And then when we fast forward to the second episode, John tells us that Jesus was creating with God in the beginning. So we're now seeing who this other "let us make man in our image" is Jesus. And in fact, he is God who becomes flesh and dwells among us. And you have to put on your special glasses and ask the question, this is what I think is kind of the big summary question from this. Since we know that there's only one God, could it be that this God who describes himself in the plural form and this promised superhero whose origins are from eternity past, could it be that they're actually one and the same person? Could it be that God describes himself in a plural form because in this beautiful love story that he personally wrote, he is both the Creator God and the Messiah God, the author and the director and the star of the greatest story ever told, who breaks into our world as a humble man in order to rescue us from the evil villain by shedding his own blood, making atonement for our sins. Well, there's another popular film many years back called The Mask of Zorro. Anybody see that movie? Yeah. I love that movie. So hang on a second. More props. There we go. So if you recall in that story, an ordinary man named Don Diego Vega and a valiant superhero named Zorro are really one and the same person. However, no one realizes it. Even the heroine of the movie doesn't have a clue. Nobody knows because whenever Don Diego becomes Zorro, he wears a silly little mask like this. Don Diego is right there in front of everyone's eyes, but for some reason, that silly little mask blinds everyone from seeing who he really is. You probably don't know, but it's still me. Okay. You're probably wondering, where'd Gene go? So here's another verse from the second episode of God's story. 2 Corinthians 4:4 says, "The God of this age," meaning Satan, "has blinded the minds of unbelievers so they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Messiah, who is the image of God." Now, I walked into a church for the first time a little over 33 years ago. Imagine that, a Jewish man going to church. That's like a whole nother series, huh? However, something profound happened to me that day that changed the course of my life forever. On that day, the blinders fell off my eyes, and the truth was unmasked for me for the first time. I saw for the first time in my Hebrew Bible, a Bible that I had read often as a child, that it was filled with clear messages about how God, Elohim, would be both God, the author of the story, and God, the hero of the story. But for some reason, I couldn't see it clearly until I was 30 years old. It was there right in front of me all the time. But the God of this age, the devil, had blinded me from this reality for 30 years. Thankfully, 33 years ago, the God of truth decided to unmask these mysteries in his story to let me see who he really is. He's the God who loves me enough to leave the comfort of heaven and break into my world to die for me so that I can have a personal relationship with him, both now and forevermore. Let me tell you another story. Years ago, that church that I visited, I ended up going on staff there a couple years later. And a middle-aged man made an appointment to see me. This guy was brilliant. He held 2 doctorate degrees. I believe they were both in chemistry, and he had a prestigious job at a large high-tech chemical company. And in our meeting together, he told me how he'd been searching for God and truth for a long time, but everything he read and everybody he talked to, nothing made sense, and he hadn't found any answer. And he went on to tell me that he had come to our church the previous Sunday, and it happened to be an unusual Sunday because the entire service was geared towards children and their families, and it was held in an outdoor theater. On this particular day, our children performed a skit. The whole service was a skit performed by little kids about the greatest story ever told. It was the story about God's plan to build an eternal family, and it was presented in a simple format that even a young child could comprehend. And this man, who held 2 PhDs and a prestigious scientific job, was there that Sunday morning. And in spite of all the great theological works he could get his hand on about God and faith and eternity, none of them had made any sense to him up to this point. But on that Sunday, as he watched a skit with a simple message about God's grace that was acted out by children, it all made sense to him for the first time. The truth had finally been unmasked for him. So what is Foreshadows? Foreshadows, as I've said, unveils the mystery of God's plan to build an eternal family. You know that's what God's after, right? We're all crashing towards an end to the story with a new beginning with an eternal family under God. And this series will clearly demonstrate how the Jewish people play a leading role in this story throughout all of history and even beyond. Foreshadows allows us to see how the entire Bible is one seamless, beautiful, adventure-packed love story from beginning to end that connects the dots through all 3 dramatic episodes. Because God wrote this seamless love story, and it'll take many nail-biting twists and turns before his goal to build an eternal family is accomplished. And we today are all witnesses firsthand of some of those nail-biting events that are taking place. You just have to read the headlines. How about read yesterday's headlines? How about last night's headlines? So Foreshadows examines, here's the core of it. Foreshadows examines 7 prophetic pictures of God's unbreakable covenant relationship with Israel from the first episode of this thrilling trilogy that find their messianic fulfillment in the second episode and become eternally completed in a place the Bible calls New Jerusalem in the third and final episode. Did you catch that? Let me say it again. Foreshadows examines 7 prophetic pictures of God's unbreakable covenant relationship with Israel from the first episode of this thrilling trilogy that find their messianic fulfillment in the second episode and become eternally completed in a place the Bible calls New Jerusalem in the third episode. The 7 foreshadows that make up God's relationship with Israel that we'll look at in depth, one foreshadow at a time over the course of this series, are these. Number 1, it's the covenant. The covenant is God's marriage proposal to Israel. Once you have a marriage, then you usually have kids, right? And so the nation of Israel is the second foreshadow. Once you have a family, well, you got to have a place to live, and that's the promised land. That's the family home. Every good family has to have a healthy set of rules. That's the Torah. That's the law, which is the family rules. And also healthy families need to have good, dad's got to be present. He's got to have access, give access to their kids. And so that's the temple. That's the foreshadow of the temple. And then the Sabbath or Shabbat is the time set apart for the family to be together. And the feasts are a series of annual family celebration unions. Those are the 7 foreshadows. We'll look at them in depth. Together, these 7 foreshadows unmask the mystery of God's plan to build that eternal family. And they all follow this 3-phase progressive pattern in God's trilogy that I think will absolutely blow your mind when we get into them. Next week, we have one more introductory message to give, and then we'll hit all 7 of them and wrap it up with a conclusion on the 10th message. That's kind of the plan. And remember, these are all built on the foundation of God's trilogy-like sacred name, Yud-He-Vav-He, the God who was. That's the first episode of prophetic pictures. The God who is, from the second episode where they find their messianic fulfillment, and the God who will be, from the third and final episode of eternal completion in New Jerusalem. Or as Revelation 4:8 says it, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, as the angels sing, who was, the first episode, who is, the second episode, and who is to come, episode 3. And my prayer is that Foreshadows will build your faith and inspire your heart in ways you've never experienced before, as they help you see God's complete story, maybe for the first time, and more importantly, how your story, do you realize God wrote your story too, right? What did the psalmist say? All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. A book? God's got some kind of a book? Yeah. It's called the greatest story ever written. And I hope that as we go through this, you'll see how your story, the story God wrote for you personally, intersects into this bigger story, because there's nothing better than to awaken to that truth. So let's pray together. Lord, there is no one like you. There's no God like you. When we think about